everybody, and welcome to another live episode of the Experience Maker Live. I'm Dan Gingiss, the Experience Maker. Happy to have you here this week and every week, although we did have a little bit of a hiccup last week. I apologize for that, so we didn't have a program, but we are back and better than ever today for today's show. I'm going to get right into it. No promos, no talking about my book or anything else. I want to get right into this conversation because I am very excited to have one of the globe's foremost customer experience experts from across the pond in the UK. He is a global CX specialist and author of Customer What? The Honest and Practical Guide to Customer Experience. Ian Golding, welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Dan. You say far too nice things about me, but it's very kind of you to say so. I'm the Dan Gingiss with hair. That's what I like to say.
I'll take it. That's great. You know, I had my very first podcast, which ended 5 years ago, was called Focus on Customer Service. And my co-host was Dan Moriarty, who is also a fine British fellow. And we used to refer to ourselves as British Dan and American Dan. And somebody explained to me that in podcasting, there's this idea of what's called vocal texture. And that as you're listening, it really helps to have different voices and different accents because it just keeps people interested. So I think we can definitely bring some vocal texture.
There you go. And actually, I always say I have a face for radio, Dan. So that I think that confirms that this will work. Vocal texture, we'll go with that.
Yes, sounds good. So for those who remarkably don't know you, and that's got to be almost no one, tell us a little bit about your background and what you're doing today.
So as you say, I am, like you, a customer experience specialist working with organizations on every continent on Earth to understand what this thing really is, what I now call the science of CX, I like to call it, but more importantly, how to turn the science into something that is practical and demonstrable. And I've been doing it for far too many years now. How I haven't gone grey is a mystery to everyone, or lost my hair. But what I'm still feeling very thankful for is that I get to see customer experience in every continent, every industry, every state of evolution. So every week I'm learning something that I didn't know before. And that's one of the wonderful things about what we do, is that we are always in a different situation, which allows us to become better at what we do.
I totally agree. I like to tell clients there is no end to customer experience. So if you're sort of hoping to get to the finish line, you're going to be disappointed.
I have had clients say to me, "We don't need you now, Ian. We've done it." It's like, but we're always going to get those.
Yeah. Well, I also like that you refer to it as a science. I want to dig into that a little bit more, because one of the things that I experienced in corporate America before I left is this feeling that CX is a soft skill, that it's not like finance, which is a hard skill. It doesn't drive the bottom line. It's a nice to have, not a must have. How do you respond to that?
It is a fundamental issue. And it is one of the primary reasons why organizations aren't still to this day seeing a connection between customer experience and financial performance. Because customer experience, as we know, is a discipline in its own right. But it's only in relatively recent terms that that's been the case. I always argue that actually it was the formation of the CXPA in 2011 that formalized the discipline of customer experience. That's 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. It's nothing in relative terms. But what many businesses, leaders, individuals still don't really understand is that sitting behind the words customer experience are a number of competencies. And it's those competencies that will determine whether or not a business can become sustainably customer-centric. Now, one of the challenges, though, with the science is that those competencies are not applied in an exact way. As you've said, there's no one way of doing any of this. So whilst I describe customer experience as a science, it's not an exact science. And the skill of the customer experience professional is having sufficient knowledge of the competencies to determine how best to apply them in whatever scenario they face. And that is really hard. that this is not a discipline where you can just learn stuff. You've got to know it and then understand how to apply it in whatever situation you face. That's tough.
And I would argue all at the same time is bringing everybody else into the fold, because you've got to be an internal influencer as well. I like to call it influence without authority sometimes.
Absolutely.
Because we need those finance people involved. We need the legal team involved. We need the marketing team involved. And all of them are going to, the easy answer is that's not my job.
That's right.
And so let's talk a little bit about this idea of customer experience is everyone's job versus customer experience is the job of a single team within the organization.
Absolutely. So the way I articulate this is that customer experience is the representation of everything an organization does that enables their customers to interact with their products and services. And every employee has a role to play in doing that. However, as you've just said, Dan, there is a very simple question that you can ask any employee to determine whether or not they understand that. That simple question being, what role do you play in delivering the customer experience? And if the response to that question is one of two things, they are proving to you that they don't know. The two things being, it has nothing to do with me, or I'm just in IT. I'm just in finance. It's got nothing to do with me. And this is unfortunately, again, so common in all industries. And so what I like to articulate to people is that we need organizations to visualize the experience they're delivering to their customers as an interconnected chain of events. Every single employee in an organization, whether they know it or not, is a link in a chain connecting products and services to customers. We need every link in that chain to understand their role. It only takes one link in the chain not to understand the role, and the chain breaks. And this is the problem, because those facing the customer every day, well, they know what's happening. But those who aren't directly facing the customer aren't consciously understanding that what they do is actually impacting those that are directly connecting with customers. They're as much a part of that chain as those who talk to the customer every day. And this is a principle actually that I call the employee hero, actually, because whether people know it or not, whether businesses know it or not, it's us, it's our people who are the real heroes bringing the experience to life for customers every day.
Absolutely. One of the keynotes that I do is called Why Every Employee is in the Customer Experience Business. And it comes from an interview that I did with an owner of about a dozen breweries in the United States, Scotty's Brew House. And when you ask Scotty what business he's in, he says, I'm in the customer experience business. He doesn't say I'm a restaurateur, I'm in the food business, I'm in the customer experience business. And that is what we want all of our employees to feel.
Yeah.
So what I love doing is going through different areas of the company, because usually you're going to have somebody say, well, okay, but I'm just in finance, as you said. Well, the finance person might be determining the methods of payment that your company accepts. In Chicago, pre-pandemic, I found two fast casual restaurants, one of which decided to go to cash only, and one of which decided to go to no cash. And you think about the difference in experience between those and who that affects, right? You have people that might be unbanked, that don't have a card. So if you're not taking cash, I don't know how they're eating at your restaurant.
It's funny you mentioned finance, because I facilitated a workshop on Monday on this very subject. And there was a lady from finance who did a variety of things, from accounts receivable to, various other bits and pieces. And I asked her and everyone else in the room, as a cross-functional group, where do you sit in that metaphorical chain of events? Do you come at the beginning? Do you come in the middle? Do you come in the end? And she stood in front of this sheet of paper on the wall and she just looked really confused. And I went up to her and said, are you okay? She said, well, I'm starting to realize I didn't think we had anything to do with this chain. But actually, we come there, we come there, we come there, we come there. We're everywhere. In fact, if you take us out, the chain doesn't connect together. And it was like an epiphany. And that's really what we need people to understand, is that we're all a part of this. The only other thing, just to say before you continue, how come you get to work with breweries? I'm the British guy. I should be working with breweries. That's not fair.
You get to work with pubs. We don't have pubs here.
You see, that's the problem. I don't. I get pharmaceutical companies and pump manufacturers, and I want breweries.
Well, hey, one of the things I preach is that no industry has to be boring. Just because it is doesn't mean it needs to be.
That's
and
true.
So our job is to help them not be boring.
That's true. Your pronunciation of pub, by the way, was very good. I'm impressed with that.
Thank you. By the way, I got to put you front and center here again, because I have to say, when I made you big on the screen, I appreciated your background. I think you have two of the greatest customer experience books in the history of books behind you. So thank you for that.
Actually, they complement each other quite nicely.
They do. The color scheme is kind of related, they look like they belong together. That's awesome. So, obviously, we are hopefully coming out of a global pandemic that's lasted the better part of 2+ years. We were talking right before we went on about live events coming back and people sort of slowly returning. I was at an event last week. You were at an event, and we're seeing people so happy to be there and excited and all that. Do you think, obviously companies had to learn a lot about customer and employee experience very quickly during the pandemic. As we come out of it, what do you think's different? And I guess the big question is, do you think we'll be prepared for whatever the next world calamity is?
That's a brilliant question. Let me start on that. I think you're younger than me, Dan, but do you remember Y2K? Okay.
Of course, yes.
Now, who can, if you're old enough, that is listening to this, you can't forget Y2K, because the world convinced itself that the world was going to end as soon as the clock clicked on to the year 2000. And the amount of preparation work that was done ahead of that was phenomenal. We were prepared for everything and nothing happened. The reason I mention it is that we get to a global pandemic and no one's prepared for a global pandemic, and suddenly the world is having to react instantly to the Armageddon scenario that didn't happen in Y2K. Okay. Now, the reason I mention it is that what we learned is that actually we can do things very quickly if we want to. I think one of the most incredible things that businesses realized right from the very beginning is that it doesn't have to take committee after committee after committee, approval process after approval process. It doesn't have to take years to implement technological change. If we need to change something quickly, we can do it almost overnight. And I think that was a brilliant thing for businesses to realize. What we also saw was a huge increase in collaboration. Businesses realize, guys, we've got to come together and figure out how to do this. Suddenly people are talking to each other, which was wonderful. Now, when we get to the current day, coming out of this, we are still coming out because it is still very much here. And there are still many organizations blaming the pandemic for the way that they continue to do things, the way that they continue to interact with customers. But as we come out of this pandemic, there are a number of big concerns for me. One is that we're not thinking today, what are we going to do the next time a pandemic comes? Because it's going to happen again. But what company has put a process in place to start planning for the next one? That's the first thing. The second thing is that one of the downsides of the last 2 years is that many businesses didn't have a choice in most cases, but to tighten their belts and to unfortunately get rid of resources that were seen as just unnecessary, and to sort of restrict the size of their operation. The problem is that what that generated was a greater need for the employees that were left to do things. And there is a word that I am increasingly disliking as time goes on, the word being stretched. Everyone tells me on a daily basis we're stretched. And people are telling me that they are now more stretched than they've ever been before. And what that means is that people are becoming more and more task focused than they ever were before, because we've got so much that needs to be done by fewer people, which means that we are obsessing with the delivery of tasks. And all that means is that people no longer have any time to think. And if our people don't have time to think, they can't empathize with the people they're performing the tasks for. They can't consider how they're making those people feel. And the unfortunate consequence of this is that experiences get worse, customers become less happy, and ultimately it's damaging for the organization. I think we need to just stop for a second and think. At the end of the day, we had to work with the situation and sometimes cut cost in a way that we didn't want to. But as we come out of this, our people not having time to think is going to be hugely damaging going forward. And so, whilst people are stretched, again, I found myself in recent times talking about time and motion studies. I've not talked about that for years, but there is a greater need now than ever before for organizations to identify things that are happening that are no longer necessary. If we can strip out non-value added activity from what we're doing, then this horrible sense of being stretched can start to go away. All right. We can't keep blaming a pandemic for being stretched and not having time to do anything. We need our people to have time to think. If they don't have that, experiences will not improve.
And I would say one of the great ways to do that is whenever you hear the answer to the question, because we've always done it that way, if that's the answer, that's a good place to start looking for things to cut, because generally that's a terrible excuse. You mentioned, without saying it, you mentioned what I think is termed business continuity planning, which is basically being prepared for disaster. Now, I remember when I was in corporate America, I was in those meetings, and I remember we would laugh at the idea of a pandemic. Like, that's never going to happen, right? And to be honest, before 2001, we laughed at the idea of a terrorist attack, right? That's never going to happen. And so my question is, when I asked, do you think we're ready for next time? It's a little bit rhetorical, because obviously we have to be. There's no excuse to not be ready for another pandemic. But also, one of the things that I've been predicting but not seeing as much as maybe I thought was that business continuity planning as a skill was going to become almost as important as, the risk and privacy people have been in the last few years. And I think that business continuity planning is something that probably has to fall under customer experience eventually, because it is the customers that end up the losers when everything shuts down and the experience gets ruined. So I hear you and agree with you that this idea of being able to think, I think there's the creativity aspect of it versus just the, I don't know if I don't know if they had this in the UK, but there's an old commercial in the US for Dunkin' Donuts, and the guy gets up and says, "Time to make the donuts." He wakes up at 4 a.m. And that's sort of the sense I get of the just repetitive, just keeping the lights on versus thinking creatively.
For me, Dan, it's proactive change. Historically, organizations have always been reactive. We wait for things to go wrong, then we try and put it right. That awful expression of the burning platform. We need the platform to be burning before we do something. Okay, well, that doesn't work in 2022 anymore. Whether there's a pandemic or not, it doesn't work, because we now live in a world that is constantly being disrupted, whether it be a pandemic, whether it be conflict, as we're seeing in, unfortunately, Eastern Europe right now, or whether it be disruption within your industry. At the end of the day, you cannot just wait, because if you wait, it's too late. And, what I'm hoping is that message does get through, but at the moment, I can't see it. I still can't see that proactive, let's think forward. I can't see it enough in legacy organizations.
Well, you mentioned the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. It's possible, I hope not, but it's possible in a couple of weeks, couple of months, that we're talking about a major escalation,
Absolutely.
that we're talking about other countries being involved, that we're talking about World War III. And where's that in the business continuity plan? And is anybody focused on that? I'm sensing a lack of urgency around that.
That's right.
Let's wait and see. And it's that same mistake that I think we made with the pandemic, which is that just no one, even when things started to look bad in January, February, I remember, so every morning I wake up and listen to NPR News, public radio, and I remember in December of 19, January, February of 20, they were already counting the cases in China. And I remember when they said they hit 1,000 cases in China. And the numbers kept growing. And yet nobody here, there was no sense of urgency. And I think we're seeing the same thing with this conflict. You mentioned supply chain. I think it's interesting. I'd be fascinated to know, so of all of the companies that have experienced supply chain disruptions, what have they done about it to prevent future supply chain disruptions, right? What are they doing to, I don't know, maybe make some products or some components domestically instead of having to import?
It's a fascinating subject, isn't it? I mean, it almost says to me, is it just too hard to think forward? Is it just, we don't need to think about that unless it actually happens, but all of those brilliant examples of the Toys R Us's of this world, in their time, we're sitting there that we don't need to go online, no, it's okay, but by the time they realize they do, it's too late. Why do human beings keep doing that? Maybe it is a sort of an inherent thing in the way human beings' brains work. But, I was always told that you can't use the word can't. Anything is possible. If you want to do it. So let's think forward. And I think that's a sort of a message that I'll be using a lot this year is stop looking backwards, think forwards. And what do we need to do to ensure the sustainable growth of our organization going forwards?
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think it's important in every industry. It's important whether you're upstream, downstream, whether you're B2C, B2B, D2C, B2G, whatever characters you want to put together. It's important in all of them because what we saw in the last 2 years is total disruption. I don't think we've seen that in our lifetime, but I agree with you. I think we will see it again in our lifetime. I think for sure this isn't the last pandemic that we see in our lifetime.
But what's interesting, so some industries do adapt to it better than others. I think, but does it get as much recognition as it should is a different matter. Again, I assume this would have been the same in the US, but in the UK, the hospitality sector was brutal. Restaurants were, it was just a disaster. So what did traditional restaurants do? Well, they said, well, we can't just wait to see what happens. Let's start doing takeout. Now, but gourmet restaurants, restaurants that would never have done that. The thing is, they now know how to do it. So they're ready. If something happens again, we're ready. We'll just flick the switch and we'll start delivering.
Well, I would say even more than that. I don't think they should stop because I think a lot of people got used to, I can go to a gourmet restaurant and take out and have it at home. And maybe I still want to do that.
Yeah,
it's like curbside pickup at grocery stores, right? I like grocery shopping, but man, when I got 2 hours back on my weekend,
that's right.
I kind of got used to that. I don't want that to go away necessarily. And I think a lot of what we've seen in the last 2 years, you mentioned being able to make faster decisions, obviously the digital adaptation, but I think in a lot of ways we've improved the experience and we're not going back to what it was beforehand.
Yeah, that's true. The other dynamic to that, though, it's important to mention, is the impact on employees. I read something that there's quite a lot of stuff on LinkedIn at the moment, actually, of people saying, I was offered a brilliant job, but they said to me, I have to be in the office 5 days a week. And like, well, I don't want to do that, why do I need to be in the office 5 days a week? And so there's this other dynamic that actually the employee experience has been radically disrupted and employees don't want to go back to the way it was before.
This is a dumb example, but it's like as companies over the decades went from formal business attire to business casual to casual. Like there were companies that just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't move. Maybe you'd have a jeans day once a month, but they just weren't going to do it. And then it kind of all exploded.
What I don't get, a brilliant story, Dan, of General Motors. You'll have to excuse my terrible recollection of names. The CEO of General Motors was a lady. I can't remember her name. This is a few years ago, and I was told a story where when she started, the VP of Human Resources was having his first meeting with her, and he came with all of their policies. And one of the policies was a dress code policy. And apparently it was like a book like this. And she said, "What's that?" And he said, "It's the dress code policy." Okay. Apparently that night she sent him an email saying, "I've changed the dress code policy." And he emailed back saying, What is it?" And she said, "Dress appropriately."
Yes.
Just brilliant.
It makes so much sense. And I'll tell you that I know we got to finish up here, but this thing with the making people come into work, what's also being missed is the opportunity now that everybody knows how to work remotely. If you have a business that's in some rural area of the country, you now have the ability to hire somebody from a major metropolitan area, the best of the best for your company because they can work remotely. And so it's just like in customer experience where sometimes we just have to turn it around to kind of see the light and the opportunity. To me, that's the big opportunity for companies is you can hire somebody from anywhere now. And so instead of just having to look within a 10-mile radius of your office for the best person, which if you're in a small area is tough to do, there's not a lot to choose from. Now the whole world is your oyster. And I think that's that's such an interesting opportunity for companies.
100%. One particular day during the pandemic, I worked in 10 countries in the same day. I mean, we couldn't have done that before.
No, not at all. All right, Ian, sadly, we are out of time, but please tell us, how can people connect with you?
Unfortunately, I'm far too visible sometimes. So if you go on LinkedIn, you will see my ugly mug on LinkedIn. Just feel free to connect with me. They can email me at ian@ijgolding.com. I'm very unusual for lots of reasons. If you've got a question, just reach out and I will do my best to answer it.
Awesome. Well, such a pleasure to have you here today. I feel like we could talk for another couple of hours,
sure we could.
But keep doing what you're doing. And you and I have got to figure out how to, at an event or something, we got to be in the same place at the same time.
It's going to happen, Neil, Dan. It's going to happen, definitely.
Awesome. I look forward to it. Well, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
All right, and thank you for being here. I so appreciate it. Next week, we are going to have another really interesting guest. He is Abraham Venismach. He's a voiceover artist and also the owner of 2 LinkedIn groups on customer service that together have more than 200,000 members. So I got to have a call with Abraham a couple of weeks ago, thought that he was a fascinating guy and invited him to be on the show. So we will see him next week. I'll see you next week as well, and every Thursday at noon Eastern. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Dan Gingiss, the Experience Maker. Have a great rest of the week and a terrific weekend.